The silence in the grand hall of the Shilla Hotel was not empty. It was dense, suffocating, engineered by wealth and centuries of dynastic expectation. 10,000 white Phalaenopsis orchids hung from the vaulted ceiling, their cloying, powdery scent masking the metallic tang of anxiety radiating from the 500 guests. At the front of the room, standing beneath a canopy of woven gold, was the heir to the largest chaebol empire in South Korea, a family whose bloodline traced directly back to the Joseon kings. And in the back row, half hidden behind a marble pillar, sat Nia. She was the only black woman in the room. In a sea of muted Chanel, bespoke midnight blue suits, and meticulously crafted pastel handbox, her rich dark skin and the crown of her tightly coiled hair made her hyper-visible. Every shift of her weight in the creaking mahogany chair drew eyes that slid away the moment she looked back. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingernails biting half-moons into the flesh of her palms. The pain grounded her. It kept the tears trapped behind the burning walls of her eyes. At the altar, the officiant, a former prime minister, spoke in low, rhythmic Korean, the cadence of the vows rolling through the microphone. The bride, wrapped in custom Dior that shimmered like crushed pearls, turned to her groom, Jae-hyun. He looked like a stranger. His shoulders were rigid beneath the structured wool of his tuxedo. His jaw, usually soft with a quick, private smile, was locked into a sharp, unforgiving line. He had not looked at the crowd once. The officiant paused, asking the traditional question of intent. The bride smiled, murmuring her assent. The microphone was shifted to Jae-hyun. The silence stretched. 1 second, 3 seconds, 5. The low hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roar. A murmur rippled through the front rows. The patriarch of the family, seated in a velvet-backed chair, leaned forward, his silver cane rapping sharply against the floor. Jae-hyun brought the microphone to his lips. He did not look at his bride. He slowly, deliberately turned his head, his dark eyes scanning the vast expanse of the hall, cutting through the dignitaries, the celebrities, the sea of expectant faces, until his gaze locked onto the shadow behind the marble pillar in the back row. He breathed into the microphone, a harsh, fractured intake of air. Nia! The name cracked like a gunshot through the speakers. 500 heads turned in unison. The silence that followed was no longer engineered. It was absolute, violent, and utterly terrifying. To understand how a name could shatter an empire, you had to understand the dust. 2 years prior, Nia had not known the scent of white orchids. Her world smelled of cedarwood, camphor, and ancient deteriorating silk. As a senior textile conservator flown in from the Smithsonian to assist the National Palace Museum in Seoul, Nia spent her days in the subterranean, climate-controlled archives. The air was perpetually 55 degrees, harsh on the lungs, but necessary for the survival of the artifacts. She lived in isolation, speaking a broken, functional Korean, retreating into the meticulous rhythm of her work. She spent hours leaning over centuries-old ceremonial robes, using tweezers and fine sable hair brushes to align microscopic silk fibers, breathing life back into things the world had forgotten. He had walked into her lab on a Tuesday in November. The monsoon season had long passed, replaced by a bitter, dry cold that cracked the skin. Nia had been hunched beneath a magnifying ring light, her breath held as she coaxed a fraying gold thread back into a dragon motif. "You are holding your breath," a voice had said. Nia flinched, her tweezers slipping. She spun around on her stool. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark gray turtleneck and a long wool coat. Rain, the first unexpected sleet of the season, darkened his shoulders. He didn't look like a museum director or a government liaison. He looked entirely out of place among the stainless steel tables and sterile fluorescent lights, carrying an aura of quiet, heavy authority. "I have to," Nia said, her voice raspy from hours of disuse. A sharp exhale can scatter fibers that are 300 years old. "Who are you?" "I am the owner of the jacket you are currently saving," he replied, stepping into the light. He introduced himself simply as Jae-hyun. He didn't offer a title. He didn't explain that the royal blue wansum resting on her table had belonged to his great-grandmother, the last crown princess, or that his family essentially funded the entire wing of the museum. He simply pulled up a metal stool, the legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor, and sat across from her. "Show me," he said. That was the beginning. A dangerous, quiet beginning. Jae-hyun returned twice a week. He never brought an entourage. He left his security detail at the freight elevator. In the freezing, silent archive, the outside world ceased to exist. Nia taught him how to handle the bamboo spatulas, how to mix wheat starch paste. In return, he brought her warmth. He arrived with steaming cups of boricha, roasted barley tea that chased the chill from her fingers. He brought hot talk wrapped in paper, the sweet cinnamon and brown sugar melting on her tongue while he watched her eat, his dark eyes tracking the satisfaction on her face. The archive became a sanctuary. They communicated in low murmurs, their heads bowed over the same ancient garments, their shoulders occasionally brushing. With every accidental touch, a static charge leaped between them. Nia felt the isolation of soul melting away. She wasn't an outsider here. She was the center of his absolute attention. The shift happened late in January. Nia was attempting to thread a needle with silk filament. Her hands, numb from the ambient cold, were trembling. Jae-hyun reached across the steel table. He didn't take the needle. Instead, he wrapped his large, warm hands over hers. The heat of his skin seared through her latex gloves. Nia's breath hitched, trapping itself in her chest. She looked up. Jae-hyun was staring at her mouth. The museum, the city of Seoul, the ocean between her and her home, it all vanished. He leaned across the table, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw, and pressed his lips to hers. It tasted of roasted barley and cold winter air. It was a desperate, hungry confirmation of the tension that had suffocated them for months. Hope is a dangerous, fragile architecture. Nia built hers over the next 6 months. They explored the city in the dead of night, hidden beneath the anonymity of baseball caps and shadowed alleys. He took her to empty temples in the mountains, where the wind chimed through the pines. He kissed her against the cold stone of city walls. He made her believe the impossible. Then came the morning in early September. Nia was sitting in a small cafe in Itaewon, waiting for him. He was late. He was never late. The cafe's television was muted, playing the morning news. The chyron flashing across the bottom of the screen caught her eye. She couldn't read all the Hangul fast enough, but she recognized the photograph. Jae-hyun, standing beside a woman in a pristine white dress. Nia pulled out her phone, her fingers suddenly cold, clumsy. She opened a local news portal, hitting the auto-translate button. The English words loaded on the screen, brutal and indifferent. Heir to the Lee Empire announces engagement. An alliance of 2 dynasties. Wedding set for next spring. The bell above the cafe door chimed. Jae-hyun walked in. He saw her staring at the phone. The hope Nia had built over 6 months collapsed in a single, devastating second, burying her beneath the rubble. The pain did not hit Nia all at once. It arrived in a slow, agonizing crawl, mirroring the arrival of Seoul's monsoon season, the Jangma. By late June, the sky above the city turned the color of bruised iron, and the rain began to fall in heavy, relentless sheets. The humidity pressed against the windows of Nia's cramped apartment in Haebangchon, creeping into the corners of the ceiling, turning the air thick and unbreathable. Silence became the third occupant of her life. Jae-hyun had stopped coming to the museum. After the morning in the cafe, after the shattered look on his face when he realized she knew, Nia had walked out. She had refused to let him speak. What was there to say? The ancient suffocating machinery of his bloodline had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had crushed the anomaly. Nia threw herself entirely into the preservation of the past because her present was unlivable. She stayed in the freezing archive for 14 hours a day. The physical toll of heartbreak manifested in her hands. They shook constantly. She stopped drinking the boricha. She drank black coffee until her stomach burned, punishing her body to keep her mind from wandering back to the weight of his hands over hers. Days bled into weeks. The hypervisibility she felt outside the museum worsened. Every time she walked to the subway, the umbrellas of strangers parted around her like water hitting a stone. She felt the stares, the whispers. Before, Jae-hyun's presence had been a shield. Without him, she was profoundly, brutally alone, a foreign body in a city that did not want her. By August, she could no longer endure it. The pain loop was suffocating her. Hope, loss, silence. She needed recovery. Nia submitted her transfer request to the Smithsonian. She was going home to Chicago. The decision felt like exhaling a breath she had held for a year. She bought cardboard boxes, the dry, dusty smell of the corrugated paper filling her apartment, overpowering the damp scent of the monsoon. She began folding her clothes, wrapping her books. She was leaving. She was healing. The wound was sore, scabbing over. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week before her flight. The rain was lashing against her window panes, a violent drumbeat that rattled the glass. Naya was sitting on the floor, taping up a box of winter coats, when the heavy iron knocker on her door sounded. 3 sharp, desperate raps. Nia froze. The tape dispenser slipped from her hand, clattering against the hardwood. She didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. She stood, her knees aching, and walked to the door. She pressed her eye to the peephole. The breath instantly left her lungs. Jae-hyun stood in the dimly lit hallway. He was not wearing his usual tailored coat. He wore a simple black t-shirt, plastered to his chest by the rain. His hair was soaked, dripping water onto the cheap linoleum floor of her building. He looked pale, exhausted, entirely stripped of the royal armor he wore for the world. Nia unlocked the door and pulled it open just a fraction. The damp, cold air from the hallway rushed in, smelling of wet asphalt and ozone. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a sharp whisper. She kept her body blocking the entrance. She would not let him see the boxes. She would not let him see that she was running. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a rasp, raw and scraped hollow. "I am," Nia said, staring at the pulse beating frantically at the base of his throat. "My work here is done." "Nia," he stepped closer. The proximity was physical torture. The heat radiating off his wet skin reached her across the threshold. "Let me in." "No." She gripped the edge of the door until her knuckles turned ash gray. "You don't get to come here in the middle of the night. You don't get to play the tragic prince. You made your choice, Jae-hyun. You chose the empire." He flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down at the floor, the water pooling around his leather shoes. His hands were shoved so deeply into his pockets, the fabric of his jeans strained. "I have a duty," he whispered to the floorboard. "I know," Nia said, her voice dropping to a terrifying dead calm. "And I have a life. One that doesn't involve hiding in the shadows while you stand in the light with someone else. Go home, Jae-hyun." She pushed the door to close it. His hand shot out, catching the edge of the wood. The impact shuddered through her arms. He looked up, and the absolute devastation in his eyes paralyzed her. He wasn't crying, but his face was an open wound. Slowly, his other hand emerged from his pocket. He held a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of cream-colored, cotton-pressed paper, sealed with a crest of dark red wax. The gold embossing on the front caught the dim hallway light. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Naya asked, refusing to touch it. "If you don't come," Jae-hyun said, his voice cracking, "I won't know it's real. If you aren't there, I will disappear inside that room. I need you to anchor me to the earth one last time." Nia stared at him, nausea rising in her throat. The sheer selfishness of his request was staggering. He wasn't asking her to stay. He wasn't stopping the wedding. He was asking her to sit in the audience and watch him pledge his life to another woman, just so he could endure it. It was a new wound, deeper and cleaner than the first. He was tearing the scab off and pouring salt directly into the vein. "You are cruel," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her fury and her unbroken love. "I know," he breathed. He dropped the envelope onto the small welcome mat at her feet. He didn't say goodbye. He turned and walked down the dark hallway, his wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum, a pathetic, profoundly unroyal sound. Nia stood in the doorway long after the elevator doors closed. She looked down at the envelope. The gold wax crest looked like a drop of drying blood. She should have kicked it into the hall. She should have thrown it in the trash. Instead, she knelt down, picked it up, and felt the heavy, undeniable gravity of it pull her back into his orbit. The air conditioning in the Shilla Hotel's Dynasty Hall blasted against the back of Nia's neck, chilling the sweat that had gathered at her hairline. She sat rigidly behind the marble pillar, the gold-embossed envelope burning like a coal in her evening bag. Why had she come? The question cycled relentlessly in her mind, a corrosive loop. She was supposed to be on a plane to Chicago in 48 hours. Yet, here she was, wearing a simple navy silk dress, enduring the suffocating atmosphere of a world that viewed her as an invisible ghost. The scent of the 10,000 white orchids was giving her a migraine. It smelled like a funeral. The older women seated in the row ahead of her, matriarchs draped in pastel silks and jade hairpins, had been leaning toward each other, their whispers sharp and sibilant. Nia's Korean was heavily technical, suited for museums, but she knew enough conversational phrasing to catch the barbs. Who is she? Why is she sitting alone? She looks so dark against the silk. Did the catering staff sit down? Nia had squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingernails deeper into her palms. She had come to bear witness, to endure the pain completely so that when she boarded the plane, there would be nothing left to hold on to. A total incineration of hope. Then Jae-hyun spoke her name. Nia! The microphone feedback whined sharply, a high-pitched squeal that made several guests wince. But nobody moved. The heads of 500 of South Korea's most powerful politicians, CEOs, and socialites remained turned toward the back row, toward the black woman, sitting alone behind a pillar. At the altar, the bride's polite smile froze, crystallizing into a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. She looked at Jae-hyun, then followed his gaze to the back of the room. The family patriarch, Jae-hyun's grandfather, half rose from his velvet chair. Jae-hyun, the old man barked, his voice lacking a microphone but carrying the terrible weight of absolute authority. What are you doing? Read the vow. Jae-hyun did not look at his grandfather. He didn't look at the bride. His eyes were locked on Nia, burning with a dark, terrifying intensity. He slowly lowered the microphone. He placed it on the small acrylic podium. Then, he reached up to his chest. Pinned to the lapel of his tuxedo was a diamond-encrusted brooch, the Lee family crest, a symbol of his inheritance, his billions, his position as the heir apparent. With a sharp, violent tug, Jae-hyun ripped the brooch from his lapel. The heavy fabric of the tuxedo tore with an audible rip. He dropped the diamonds onto the altar. They hit the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline clatter. A collective gasp tore through the room. The bride took a step back, her hands flying to her mouth. Jae-hyun stepped off the altar. Nia's heart stopped. A physiological freeze response seized her limbs. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the sudden, chaotic murmuring of the crowd. He was walking down the aisle. The walk seemed to take an eternity. His stride was long, predatory, and entirely focused. He bypassed the front row of dignitaries. He walked past the media cameras that had suddenly started flashing in a blinding, stroboscopic frenzy. Nia couldn't breathe. The delayed information, the missing piece of the puzzle, suddenly snapped into terrifying clarity. He hadn't invited her to watch him surrender. He had invited her to watch him burn the empire down. Jae-hyun! His father yelled from the second row, lunging forward to grab his son's arm. Jae-hyun violently shrugged off the grip, not even breaking his stride. The silence of the room had shattered entirely, replaced by a rising crescendo of outrage, confusion, and panic. Security guards and earpieces were suddenly moving along the walls, uncertain of what protocol applied when the principal asset was the one causing the threat. He reached the back row. He stood above Nia. Up close, she could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. The rigid mask he had worn at the altar was gone. His chest was heaving. He looked terrified. He looked alive. I told you, Jae-hyun said, his voice barely audible over the screaming room. I needed you to anchor me to the earth. He held out his hand. Nia stared at it. His hand was trembling. The large, warm hand that had guided bamboo spatulas and coaxed ancient silk back together. The hand that had held hers in the freezing dark of the archive. If she took it, she would become the most hated woman in this country. She would destroy an alliance. She would ruin him. They will strip you of everything, Nia whispered, her voice shaking violently. You will have nothing. If I stay here, he said, his eyes pleading, I am nothing. The patriarch's cane smashed against the marble floor at the front of the hall. Guards were moving down the aisle now. Time had run out. Nia reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed over hers with a crushing, desperate grip. The heavy gold signet ring on his finger dug painfully into her skin, but it anchored her. With a sharp tug, he pulled her to her feet. "Run," he said. He didn't lead her back down the aisle. He pulled her toward the heavy oak service doors at the rear of the hall. A security guard stepped in front of them, holding his hands up. "Sir, please." Jae-hyun didn't slow down. He rammed his shoulder into the guard's chest, knocking the man aside with a brutal, uncharacteristic display of force. He hit the push bar of the oak doors, and they burst open into the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the hotel's back of house. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, instantly muting the chaos of the Dynasty Hall. But the silence didn't return. It was replaced by the frantic slapping of Nia's heels against the linoleum and the heavy thud of Jae-hyun's leather shoes as he dragged her toward the fire exit. They hit the stairwell, descending into the concrete belly of the underground parking garage. The air turned instantly cold, smelling of exhaust fumes and damp cement. "Where are we going?" Nia gasped, her lungs burning, the side seam of her silk dress tearing as she struggled to keep up with his long strides. "Away," he breathed. "Just away." He slammed his hand against the emergency exit door, thrusting them out into the cavernous, echoing expanse of the subterranean garage. The underground parking garage was a cathedral of shadows and concrete pillars. Their footsteps echoed loudly, bouncing off the walls like gunshots. Jae-hyun didn't stop running until they reached a sleek, black Aston Martin parked in an isolated VIP bay. He keyed the ignition from his pocket. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the dust swirling in the cold air. He yanked the passenger door open, virtually shoving Nia inside before sprinting around the hood. He dropped into the driver's seat, hit the ignition button, and the engine roared with a guttural, violent sound. Tires shrieked against the painted concrete as he threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel with one hand. They tore out of the garage, bursting up the ramp and into the blinding neon glare of the Seoul night. The rain had returned. It fell in thick, greasy sheets, smearing the windshield and turning the city streets into a mirror of red taillights and blue neon signs. Jae-hyun drove with a reckless, terrifying focus. He merged onto the Olympic Expressway, the engine howling as he pushed the car past 100 kilometers an hour, weaving through the heavy evening traffic. Nia sat pressed against the leather seat, clutching the door handle. Her chest heaved. The adrenaline was peaking, making her hands shake so violently she had to clamp them between her knees. She looked at Jae-hyun. His profile was illuminated by the passing streetlights, flashes of stark yellow across his sharp jaw, his wet hair plastered against his forehead. The torn lapel of his tuxedo hung limply. He had done it. He had actually done it. The silence inside the car stretched, thick and pregnant, with the colossal magnitude of what had just occurred. The fairy tale aspect was evaporating, rapidly replaced by the cold, brutal reality of the aftermath. "You're an idiot," Nia whispered. The words cut through the dark cabin. Jae-hyun didn't look away from the road, but his grip on the leather steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. "A complete, reckless idiot," Nia continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a sudden spike of panic. "Do you understand what you just did? The media, your family, they will ruin you. They will freeze your accounts. They will destroy your name." "I know," he said softly. "You don't have a job. You don't have a degree that isn't tied to your family's endowment. You don't even know how to ride the subway, Jae-hyun." He suddenly swerved, pulling the car violently off the expressway and down a darkened ramp. The tires hydroplaned slightly on the wet asphalt before catching traction. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park beneath the massive concrete overpass of the Bampo Bridge. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the dark expanse of the Han River flowed silently, a black ribbon cutting through the neon-drenched city. The smell of river water, wet earth, and the faint greasy scent of fried chicken from a nearby shuttered vendor tent seeped through the air vents. Jae-hyun turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the metal roof. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face her. "I know," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "I know I have nothing now. I know my grandfather is currently ensuring I will never hold a position in this country again. I know the press will find us, and they will be brutal to me, and they will be even more brutal to you." He reached across the console. He gently pried Nia's rigid, trembling hands from between her knees. He held them in his, his thumbs tracing the frantic pulse at her wrists. "I know it is terrifying," he whispered, looking deep into her eyes, the dark brown of his irises swimming with unshed emotion. "But when I stood on that altar and I looked at my future, a life of boardrooms, of polite, loveless arrangements, of maintaining a bloodline at the cost of my own soul, I realized I was already a dead man." He leaned closer, the scent of the rain and the faint, expensive cologne he wore washing over her. "I am terrified, Nia," he confessed, his voice breaking on her name. "I have no idea what tomorrow looks like, but for the first time in my entire life, the choice is mine, and I choose you, even if we have to run, even if we have to start with nothing." Nia looked at the tear in his lapel. She looked at the expensive, useless tuxedo. She thought of the pristine white orchids, the suffocating expectations, the perfectly engineered life he had just incinerated for the right to hold her hands in a freezing car beneath a bridge. The panic inside her began to recede, washed away by the raw, undeniable truth in his voice. The pain loop had finally broken. There was no more silence. There was no more hiding. Nia slowly pulled one hand free from his grip. She reached up, her fingers trembling as they brushed the damp hair away from his forehead. Her skin, dark and warm, rested against the pale curve of his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a desperate, heavy sigh, like a man who had been drowning for years and had finally broken the surface. "I have 2 tickets to Chicago," Nia said softly. "My flight leaves in 48 hours. Jae-hyun opened his eyes, a small, tentative smile, the first she had seen in months, pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose," he whispered, his hand coming up to cover hers against his face, "I will have to learn how to pack." The rain continued to fall over the Han River, washing away the dust, the empires, and the expectations of 1,000 ancestors. They sat in the dark, 2 exiles from different worlds, staring out at the unknown, anchored only by the heat of each other's hands. We spend so much of our lives building cages made of other people's expectations, polishing the bars until they look like crowns. But when you look at the life you were supposed to live, and the life your soul is screaming for, which one are you willing to burn down? Have you ever had to walk away from everything you knew, just to find out who you really are?